On this episode of µCast, I'm going to show you how to upgrade your particle device firmware to a pre-release version. The first question you might have is, Kevin, why on earth would I want to upgrade my particle device to a pre-release version of the firmware? And that's an excellent question indeed. A few days ago, I was digging around the particle docs repo on GitHub and noticed an entire section in the firmware documentation on logging that doesn't show up on the docs page of the website. Upon closer inspection, I realized that this logging feature was new to version 0.6.0 of the firmware. How do I get version 0.6.0, I thought? It turns out it's quite simple, and there are a couple of ways to do it. Let me show you how. For demonstration purposes, I'll use a particle photon, but this process is the same for any device in the particle family. To get started, I'll connect my photon to my laptop via the USB cable. Next, I'll open up the Tinker project, which is the default app on any new particle device in the Particle Build IDE. As a quick reminder, the Particle Build IDE is the web-based IDE that you can access at build.particle.io. If we head over to the Devices tab here and click on it, you'll see that the star indicates that Frigi is the name of the photon that I'm building for right now. And if you look at this combo box here, this drop-down, it says building with firmware, and it shows that I'm building with firmware 0.5.2. This is the version of the firmware your project will be compiled against whether you use Particle Build, Dev, or the CLI as of the making of this video. Let's confirm this really quickly. There are a couple of ways to get your device firmware version, but I've found the easiest is to put the device in listening mode by holding down the setup button for about 3 seconds until it starts to flash blue. Once the LED starts flashing blue, we are in what's called listening mode. Now we can simply use a terminal program to check the firmware version. On my Mac, all I have to do is type screen/dev/cu.usb, and then I can hit tab, USB modem 1411. That is my particle photon, and hit enter. And now all I have to do is press V for version. Now, if you're on Windows, that's no problem. You can use a utility like PuTTY to accomplish the same thing. So you can see that currently I'm running system firmware version 0.5.2, but I really want to play with this new logging feature. So back in the Build IDE, I'm going to add a few lines of code, and I've already written these. I'm just going to uncomment them. Serial log handler. I'm going to add a delay to give us some time to see the logging. But when I try to verify my code, you'll see that I get some errors. Remember, that's because this new logging stuff is only available in 0.6.0 versions of the firmware or higher. This is very easy to fix. All we have to do is open the Devices tab again and select a different version of the firmware. And I'm going to select version 0.6.0-RC.2, which, as you can see, is designated as a pre-release version. Now when I come back and try to verify my code, you'll see that everything works just fine. The only step I have left is to flash my device. And so I will come up here and I will hit flash. And you'll notice this does not work, and that's because our particle is still in listening mode. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the reset button. That'll get us back into the breathing scion state, which means that it's connected to the cloud and listening. And there we got the request timed out. And I will try to flash again. And this time we should start to see the flashing magenta. And when you do this, you may notice that it takes a little longer to flash your program than usual, and that's because the particle cloud is smart enough to realize it needs to update the actual firmware running on the photon before flashing your new code, and takes care of it over the air for you. That's pretty awesome. That magenta flashing right there, that is the firmware being updated, and that will be followed by actually updating your code. Now that I'm back to the breathing science state, I'll put the particle back into listening mode by holding the setup button again for 3 seconds. You'll see the flashing blue LED. I'll bring my terminal back, open screen again, and this time when I type V, you'll see that it says my system firmware version is 0.6.0-RC.2. How easy was that? What we can also do at this point is see our logging in action. So I'm going to hit reset, and remember I have 5 seconds to restart my screen, and as it boots up we should see some log output. And there it is, outputting my system version information, which, if you look at the command that I added earlier, it's this line right here. You can see I'm in the directory here. If I hit ls, I have tinker.ino. In my terminal, I've already installed the particle CLI by doing an npm install -g particle.cli. And I also logged in using particle login. From the command line, I can compile a project and flash a device with a single command in the format of particle flash, the name of the device, which is Frigi in my case, and the file that I want to flash, tinker.ino. However, that will use the default firmware. To target a version newer, such as 0.6.0, all I have to do is add the target command. And I can do that by doing target 0.6.0-RC.2, using the same syntax that we saw in the Web IDE. Now, when I hit enter, my file will be built against the newer firmware, and if necessary, just like with the Build IDE, the Particle Cloud will perform that firmware update if it hasn't already happened. Okay, so that's how you update the firmware to a pre-release version in Particle Build and with the CLI. But how do we do it in Particle Dev, which is the local IDE? Unfortunately, at this time, there is not an option to update the firmware from Particle Dev. It will always compile against the current release version. This doesn't mean, however, that you can't use the local Dev IDE. It just means you can't use newer firmware features from the local IDE. Because the firmware versions are backward compatible, you can build an app based on 0.5.2 in this case, in the local Dev IDE and deploy it with no problems to your Photon, which is now running 0.6.0. So what are the limitations to this? First, there is no way to accomplish this in the local Dev IDE like we just covered, which I hope the Particle team is working to fix in a future release. The only other gotcha I've found so far is that updating the firmware in this manner only works going forward. As in, you can always specify a newer version than what is running on your device, but cannot go backward. So now that I'm running 0.6.0-RC.2, I cannot tell the Build IDE or the command line to take me back to 0.5.2. Well, that's not entirely true. I can tell them to do that, and they will both run happily, but the firmware on my Photon will not be rolled back to that version. To do that, we would need to use DFU util after building an older version of the firmware from source, but I'll save that process for another µCast. So that's how simple it is to get a jump on new firmware features before they're released. Give it a try, and maybe try out that new logging feature while you're at it. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to comment below. Otherwise, until next time, happy hacking.